Hi, my name's Ellen Fay, and together with Professor Pete Smith, we head up the Topic Advisory Group on Soil Health and Carbon Dynamics for the Land Use for Net Zero People and Nature Hub. And today we're going to be interviewing Matt Aitkenhead from the James Hutton Institute, who has a brilliant project on soil, carbon, and peatland mapping across Scotland. Hi, Matt. Would
Uh,
you like to just hi? Would you just like to say a couple of words about who you are and where you're working and what you're working on?
okay, I work at the James Hutton Institute, based at our Aberdeen site. I lead the geoinformatics group, so that's a lot of people that use GIS, but for a variety of different purposes and across a wide range of projects. Remote sensing, soil mapping, land cover mapping, a lot of interaction with policy and farming and the landscape.
Brilliant. Well, today we're going to hear about a specific project that you're working on. And what we'd love to hear about is this project, which is your peatland and soil carbon mapping. Could you just tell us briefly what the project does?
Absolutely. So there's multiple layers to this, both in terms of the data sets used and the structure of the project. But what we've tried to do firstly is improve the baseline mapping of Scotland's soil carbon stocks and the presence of peatland. And then once we've done that, we've then tried to map the peatland condition and move into mapping the potential prioritization of restoration opportunities across Scotland. So there's the baseline soil carbon mapping, which uses an approach called digital soil mapping, which is it combines a lot of different data sets, but relies a lot on the legacy soil survey data that we have at the James Hutton Institute, the Scottish Soil Database, which is combined from a variety of different survey efforts over the years. And we've linked that to how the soil is formed by factors within the landscape, and then tried to infill the gaps, you might say, to produce a map across the country. But we've focused on not just improving the resolution and the quality, but actually predicting what the carbon stocks are at different depths within the soil as well. So it's not just topsoil, it's subsoil also.
Mm. Sounds fantastic. Why would you say this level of soil carbon mapping is needed?
Oh, well, originally the mapping that's been done has either been what we call mixed mapping units. So you've got a fairly large area and it's been mapped, and it might say it was 50% peat, 50% podzol, but it doesn't tell you where that is within the mapping unit. And then there was some work to try and improve on that and improve the resolution, but it still needs to be made better because sometimes you have small pockets of peat, and the local hydrological conditions, changes in the terrain, stuff like that, can cause quite a difference. So I'm just going to briefly share my screen and I'll show you. This is the the basic product. This is actually the soil depth mapping that we've done, but then there's the mapping of the peat thickness. So this is on a story map that we've produced as an output from work across a number of different Scottish government funded projects. And if I zoom in on the map, you can see and look at what the predicted thickness is of the peat across this. This story map actually goes on in quite a lot of detail to talk about the presence or absence of drainage and erosion features, various other factors that are important. And we've brought in a lot of data sets, with the final output being that we have mapped Scotland's peat condition in terms of the condition classes that are here, for which there are fairly specific definitions that we've worked with Nature Scot, with Scottish Government, with other organisations like CEH. So that mapping has been carried out and is available now for sharing with people.
That looks absolutely fantastic. Can you say a little bit about definitions? How definitions of soil carbon and peatland differ across the UK, because I think they do slightly, and does it matter if they do?
It can matter. the definitions are different in terms of the carbon concentration and thickness of what is defined in an organic material. So in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, it's defined as organic material within the soil if it's got at least 30% carbon. And it's defined as peat if it's 30% carbon for a minimum thickness of 50 centimeters. So you've got that cumulative layer. Generally, that's the top 50 centimeters. A lot of Scotland and Northern Ireland peats are a lot deeper than that, but if they don't achieve that threshold, they're not counted as peat soils. They're called, some other type of soil. In England, the definition is the same, I believe, for the carbon concentration, but they use a 30 centimeter threshold. And so if you were to map the peatland of Scotland and England together and use the same definition, you would see a jump at the border. And so that definition can be important if you were working in an area close to the border, but also in terms of the carbon stocks and the actual functionality of the soil. Yeah, there is some consideration there that needs to be taken into account. There has been some discussion about not harmonizing this, normalizing it, and yeah, it's possible to do that, but that's an ongoing discussion.
So that would be some kind of technical ratio that everybody would agree to.
Yes, it would probably be quite important for things like the UK's greenhouse gas inventory, because then you've got a clear definition of what is peat, and there are emission factors associated with that. But it does have practical implications as well. For example, if Scotland was to adopt the definition of peat that's used in England and Wales, then we would be using the 30 centimetre definition, which would mean that we would suddenly be mapping a lot more peat than before. And the presence or absence of peat has an impact on planning and development work and stuff like that. If you're not supposed to plant trees on peatland, for example, so there might suddenly be areas where people had anticipated tree planting and now couldn't. So yeah, that conversation has to be approached cautiously, because there are a lot of consequences to just changing that simple definition.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any kind of idea of the history of why the definitions are so different when you cross a border?
Not really. The definitions were set by soil experts in the relevant countries and adopted as such, and there's usually a good scientific basis for it. For defining peat as being a certain thickness of organic matter, it's probably something to do with the growing depth of the sphagnum mosses that grow on the surface of the peat, something like that. So yeah, there will have been decisions made, but they will have been made independently by these different researchers and soil surveyors over the years.
Yeah, I guess more recent targets for reporting on things, etc., at the environmental level, encouraging harmonization, more than was necessary potentially in the past.
Yeah, and it is possible for that harmonization to take place without someone having to say, right, this is the only definition we use from now on. So, for example, Scotland has a Scottish soil classification system, but we also use international soil classification systems as well to map our soils. So it's not like that's it, we're only going to tell people to use one type. And so there's flexibility there.
Sure. I mean, the project looks incredibly useful. There are a number of mapping projects out there. How would you say that this work advances on what we already have?
I would say it goes further in providing a baseline for the peak condition as much as anything else. So it's providing the baseline for the soil carbon stocks. Every map is not perfect, and there are several maps with presence or absence of peat. But what we've done is take this further and say, okay, here's the condition of the peatland, and then working even beyond that to say, here's the likely prioritization, an indicator of how important one area might be over another if you were limited in your funds for peatland restoration, which we are. And so it's a way of trying to get the most bang for your buck, effectively. And the data sets that we've been providing have gone a long way towards informing the decision making on that.
That's really interesting. I mean, a map is generally quite a static thing. Does the condition element mean that it's dynamic and would be updated over time?
This has been done using data sets that will change over time. So what we did for the condition mapping was we actually looked at about 20, 25 different spatial data sets, and we looked at them all and said, what does this tell us about whether or not there's a particular peatland condition class here? So for example, if there was mapping that indicated that there was woodland, then that would be a clear indicator that it's a particular peatland class, which is peatland under woodland. The same for if it's flooded peat. Some of the spatial data sets, they provide kind of tentative evidence for or against a particular condition class. And so we had to weigh the evidence. Sometimes we had to generate our own evidence. For example, there's been quite a lot of work in the last couple of years on mapping the presence of drainage channels and erosion features, because there wasn't that mapping available to us before at the kind of resolution we needed. So we've combined all these data sets and brought them together, and the underlying data can or will be getting updated over time. So if there is peatland restoration going on, then we can come back 3 or 4 years later and there will be a data set looking, can we pick up on, have the drainage channels changed? Has the vegetation started to recover? Things like that. So yes, we could update this.
That sounds fantastic. So we've spoken a little bit about the question of borders. Are there similar things happening in England, Wales, Northern Ireland? And if there are that you're aware of, can they dovetail with your project?
There have been exercises going on to map the presence or absence, basically answering is there peat there or not, and also to map the soil carbon stocks. The methods across the different 4 nations have been different, but the underlying data sets that have been used have very often been the same ones, because we tend to focus on data sets that are publicly available. We understand what they are, and we can't afford to literally send out massive teams of surveyors out to just record on the ground, this is the condition class, this is P or not. So a lot of the data sets that we've used have been fairly common. The methods have differed slightly. Things like the peatland restoration prioritization could be done quite readily. All of the data sets that we've used are UK-wide data sets, or there are similar data sets for England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And research organisations tend to have access to those data sets under license for research purposes. If we were doing it for commercial purposes, that would probably be different. But the products that we're producing, we're sharing those with a variety of stakeholders, so Scottish Government, Nature Scot, a lot of others. I'm not saying it would be a trivial task, because there's quite a lot of discussion and preparation of the data sets and working out what they actually tell us, because they weren't always designed with this question in mind. So, for example, we've used the UKCH land cover mapping products, and they have got specific categories of land cover, but when they say it's bog, they just say it's bog. They don't tell you anything about the condition that's there. And so their definitions of a particular class might be quite broad, or might overlap with one or more classes that we're interested in. So we have to look at the evidence and what they're telling us and what they're not telling us.
Yeah. Yeah, big undertaking, but also, so important. I was wondering, there are different levels of national soil monitoring happening across the UK, and I think Scotland's also, very much involved in developing national soil condition mapping. Is that the type of data that might integrate with, as it accumulates new data? Will it take your project into consideration, or will it feed into your project?
There's quite a lot of synergy going on there. At JHI, we're working on several projects for the Scottish Government, particularly RESAS, within their strategic research programme. So we are reaching the end of 3 years within a 5-year programme. And there's a number of projects on the go that contribute to within what's called the National Soil Monitoring Framework. And I'm going to, rather cheekily, share an image, which I'm pretty sure this was developed by my colleague, Nikki Bagley. And this is I mean, it might look a little bit scary because of the complexity, but it draws together very nicely all of the ongoing work, the organisations and the projects that have been funded by the Scottish Government, and also names the key players. So these are the principal investigators involved in terms of how all this national soil monitoring framework is developing and being put together. So it's very much a live body of work that's being developed, and the effort in bringing this all together is quite significant. But it's allowing us to make significant advances in how we actually work with that and how we get the soil monitoring done. So
Thanks. Really helpful to see that level of integration and to understand all of those different component parts that go into.
it's a fair bit of work. I'll have to go and speak to Nikki afterwards and say I used your diagram again, because this is not the first time I've used it. It's pretty useful for just giving an overview of what's going on.
Yeah, sometimes just visualize and making a visualization of something can be so helpful to everybody to understand actually
Yeah.
goes into something. I mean, we've covered this slightly, but do you feel like your project could be extended south of the border?
Yes. So there's nothing about the data sets or the methods that we used for the Scottish work that couldn't be either directly applied or adapted to data sets that are available across the other four nations. There are, in terms of the baseline soil carbon mapping, we used the Scottish Soil Database, which, like I've said, is an amalgamation of lots of survey work that's been done over the years. Similar data exists within England and Wales. So there's the countryside survey work. There's Cranfield's Landis system and their national soil mapping. So there's those data sets available. And then on top of that, for the condition mapping and restoration prioritization, the types of data sets that we've used are very often UK-wide. So we have those. The different four nations, each of the four nations does have peculiarities in terms of, as we've said, how they define peatland and stuff like that. But there is generally a move towards having a UK-wide set of definitions for peatland condition classes. And that's involved quite a lot of work as well towards pinning down clear definitions so that someone could go into the field and use these rule sets effectively to say, here's the condition class that I am on, and each of those classes is associated with a particular greenhouse gas emission factor. So we're working towards this, and yes, at the wider level, there's the UK greenhouse gas inventory, which would really benefit from having all of this work done. So Scotland can contribute now in terms of that, if that mapping is adopted, and similar work going on in England, Wales, Northern Ireland, that could be brought into that as well. It won't all be universally harmonized. It never will be, but we're very close to talking the same language.
Brilliant. We've talked a lot about data sets. Can you describe where there are intersections between data sets that are open access and data sets that are not, and how that affects sort of whether the project could be grown out or not?
Yeah. So the principle that we operate on in JHI is relatively simple in terms of having a simple in idea, maybe not simple in execution, having an open science and open data policy. And that can be stated as, if the public paid for it, then the public has the right to access it. So taxpayer-funded research, which makes up a large amount of what we do at the James Hutton Institute. We don't just provide reports to the Scottish Government. We do that, but we also work to provide data sets and reports and guidance to regulatory bodies, etc. These data sets are often underpinned by open access data that we use. Sometimes there are data sets which we cannot share directly, but we can use them to produce our data products. There might be economic sensitivity, there might be existing license agreements. So we'd either, when you get a license agreement for using a particular data set, it's generally a case of you're allowed to use it for research purposes only, or you're only allowed to release the products under agreement with whoever gave you this data set, or there's specific types of open source licensing, there's specific ways in which you're restricted. There's a dialogue that goes on. And there are some data sets that would be good to have, but there are political, economic sensitivities around their use, or when people started capturing this data, they simply didn't anticipate that it was going to be used for something. So the agreement they have with the farmers that they were on their land, they captured the data. There was an agreement put in place of this is what the data will be used for. But now we're talking about potentially using for a wider set of things, and that's not included in the original discussion. So how do you fix that without having to go back to every farmer and saying, can we have a discussion about additional use of your data? So yeah, the data licensing, data sharing becomes a big part of the conversation. It's not just about the fancy programming and computing and GIS.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the whole thing is fascinating scientifically. Can you say a bit about what you think it's going to be used for?
Yes. So a lot of what I showed you within that diagram, the soil monitoring framework, and this work is a big part of what's going on in there, particularly relating to peatland. That's in response, direct response to the Scottish Government saying, here are some policy goals. We're going to fund you to provide us with research that will help us achieve these policy goals. And that's totally disassociated from particular political parties or anything like that. This is government policy developers need certain data, certain research in order to be able to make a contribution to society. But we also develop this work in line with the people that are actually going to be using the data, so regulatory bodies. I would say Nature Scot, SEPA, there are lots of others, Scottish Water, energy power companies, large estates and landowners. We talk to all these people and we develop our science in a way that will provide information for that. And a lot of the time, we engage with the people and say, what are your questions? What are the challenges that you can't answer? And let's develop the research to try and do that. We don't really go off into the blue sky thinking we're not sitting in an ivory tower doing that. This has all got to have an impact because the taxpayer paid for it. So it's got to be of benefit.
Amazing. Yeah. So it's for policy. It's also for innovation. It's for make sure that innovative companies are doing the right thing in the right place. Sort of join everything up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Other than that, can the project have uses that are more sort of on the ground, sort of above and beyond the commercial sector or the policy sector? I'm thinking, does it have a use for farmers, for nature conservation organizations?
Absolutely. I and other soil scientists at THI quite often get phone calls, and then it'll be a farmer calling us up and saying, can you tell me something about my land? Tell me, what's the land capability? What's the soil type? What's the soil carbon? They want either some information or a map or stuff like that. That happens quite a lot, and it's really quite rewarding when you do that because it's like these people are going to use this information. What we also do, we work a lot with levy boards. We work with National Farmers Union of Scotland, various other organisations and charities. The list is pretty much endless. And we like to sit down and work with them and say, okay, you've said you want this information, or you've asked us and said you've got a problem, and here's some information that might help. Let's sit and work through how we might help you answer the question. What we really don't want to do is just send someone a zip file with a data set in it and then leave them to it, because there's context. There's caveats to the accuracy of the data, what it can be used for, what it's fit for, and what it's not fit for. And yeah, quite a lot of our work involves sitting down, working through with stakeholders and saying, how can we help?
That's brilliant. I mean, on that, in terms of that sort of communication piece, where will people find this product once it's finished?
These data products will be freely available. It would be a case of, I mean, you can simply email us
Mm.
and say, can we have access to this? We also do have one or two systems by which we just put data sets online and we put pointers to them from the likes of that story map that I showed you earlier. And so it's, and there's contact details. If you can't find it within 2 or 3 clicks, there's a name and there's an email address and you can get in touch. That's for people that might have an interest but don't quite know who or what to ask for. For people that we've worked with within Scottish Government, yeah, they've probably got a list pinned next to the desk. They're like, okay, I need to speak to Matt, call him up, ask him a question, various others. So yeah, we do quite a lot of communicating and emailing, and yeah, I've been rolling in as we speak.
Wonderful. That's super progressive and really fascinating. Really looking forward to yeah, getting involved and taking a really, really closer look. Well, thanks so much, Matt. It's been lovely talking to you today.
You too.
Um, and we will make this available to people across the LUNZ Hub, but also to anybody who wants to take a look. There'll also be a clear kind of briefing about what we've talked about in writing, so anybody can drill into the issues that we've uncovered today, but in a way that is as accessible as we can make it. So thanks so much.
It's been fun. Look forward to seeing that come out.
Great.
Cheers.